Well, I want to welcome you back to our Romans Greek reading group, and we're making steady progress. We're advancing through chapter 6 of Romans, which is a very intense chapter. Paul is really working hard to show that there's a relationship between Christ's death and resurrection, which is symbolized by baptism or signified by baptism, and that our baptism then participates in the life of Christ, inasmuch as our baptism reminds us that we died with Christ and then we were raised with Christ coming out of the water. And that even though that resurrection hasn't happened yet, in Paul's understanding, we receive the Spirit of God, which is a down deposit of a future resurrection, of a future redemption of our bodies. Now, in Romans 8, he really gets there. And we're just kind of on the way there. And we're starting to see in chapter 6 some of the undoing, really, of the sin that Paul spent a couple chapters really kind of exploring, almost three chapters exploring, that infected our minds and our bodies. It affected our worship, it affected our minds, it affected our hearts, it affected our bodies. And right here, he is addressing the implications of being identified with Christ in terms of offering our bodies to not obey sin, but to obey God. And that's what we're going to get at today. So we're seeing the undoing of the effects of sin, the sin that came through Adam, but now through Christ, the second Adam, we're having an undoing of those consequences. So that's where we're going to pick up right here, verse 12. So me un basileveto e amartia ento theneto umon somati isto upokoin tes epithumies of two. So don't live any longer. Don't, therefore. So un is a conjunction. Therefore, may is working with this imperative form which has as its subject sin. And basilevo means to rule. This is a third singular present imperative form that is negated with may. And I think it's always important to understand that prohibitions, negative commands, and that's what we have here, right? They could be formed with the aorist subjunctive, may with the aorist subjunctive. It's called a prohibition. It's a construction. But may can also work with present imperatives. And then the difference is, aorist subjunctive versus present imperative. They're both prohibitions. And what's the difference? Well, the difference is that the present imperative is going to be construing imperfective verbal aspect. It's marked for that. And so there's some kind of construal about ongoingness. So how do we capture that in translation? It's hard. So do not be letting sin rule in your earthly or mortal in your mortal body. So do not be letting. So by saying do not be letting, I'm adding a construal of repeatedness or continuousness to it, which I think is fitting with the construction. So do not be letting sin rule in your mortal body. So body here is modified by theneto. This is thenetos is an adjective. It's related to Thanatos. Isn't that a marvel? Isn't that bad guy who killed a bunch of people? Yeah, he's named after the Greek Thanatos, meaning death. So here's the adjective form, meaning mortal. So do not let sin be ruling in your mortal body in order to obey its desires. In order to obey its desires. So isto with the infinitive is marking purpose. And so what Paul is saying here is that if you let, if you let sin rule in your body, in your mortal bodies, it's ruling for a purpose. It wants you to obey its desires. So sin ruling has as its intention that you obey its desires. And here I just keep thinking of Cain and Abel, right? In Genesis 3:4, God's trying to convince Cain not to let sin have its way with Cain, that sin's going to devour him like a crouching lion. Its desire is for you. And so this is what sin does. It wants to take over. Sin always promises more than it can deliver, and sin always takes more than you would expect. It starts to take over. It's like, oh well, this little sin here or this little thing, it's just a little thing, but sin always is going to want more and keep wanting to for you to obey it more and more. And sin here is personified, right? So sin is like a force. It is like a ruling force. It's like a king, right? It's a king that rules, and it's not a good thing. And so we're supposed to stop it from ruling in our bodies in order that we wouldn't obey its desires. Now, this infinitive to obey, hupakuin, is also present intense, so imperfective aspect. So there is a constant obeying that sin is expecting of us if we let it rule. When we let sin rule, there's a continual expectation that we would obey its desires. Now, this verb hupakuo takes the dative for the direct object. So that's why I've placed desires here into the dative case. Now, what is the its? I've been translating it as if it's sin, but it can't be sin, right? Because sin is feminine and it's acting as a subject. So what is this is either neuter or masculine, genitive singular. So what is this referring to? His or its? Well, we have to scan the context. There's only one thing, soma, soma, which is neuter. So this is neuter genitive plural. In form, it could be masculine. So our mortal bodies have these desires that sin is wanting us to obey. That sin is wanting us to obey the desires in our bodies. Now, this is really interesting to me because we're learning a lot about embodiment. We're learning a lot about the cognitive intersection with the human body, and it's intense. Trauma is often embodied, and our coping with trauma are ways that we try to soothe. This kind of gets embodied into, so our body gets used to doing things to soothe, to comfort, to cope. And so it's like latent in our bodies, these kinds of desires. And so the sanctification process, which Paul is really talking about here, he's really talking about how we grow in Christ, how we grow in sanctification, in purity, in rightly relating to God and to others. It is a bodily thing that we need to understand. And we're learning all kinds of stuff about this. The body keeps the score. Some of this trauma is deep seated, and it's not all bad. I mean, it needs to come out, but we will often soothe, and there's ways that we want to feel better about things, and the way that we go about feeling better can be sinful, cannot be, it's not good for us, or it's not good for others. And sometimes this stuff is not very self-reflectively understood, and people are just reacting rather than responding, rather than slowing down and looking at life and what's coming at us. But yeah, I mean, this is habituated behavior that our bodies get attuned to and get used to doing. So yeah, there is indeed a struggle with our bodies. Yeah. And then he says, nor, moreover, nor, so you have a mede. The de is adding that little bit of distinctive development. The may is also continuing the negative command. This is also a present imperative from par istemi. And I know that it's present because with me verbs like didomi, istemi, tithemi, they, in the present tense and imperfect tenses, they retain that initial iota, didomi, tithemi, istemi. And so when you're looking at forms and you're looking and you see that that iota persists, you know that you're dealing with the first principal part, present or imperfect. And since we have an imperative form here, we know that this is present, active imperative, second person plural. Nor present your bodies, or your members, I should say, present your bodies as instruments of unrighteousness for the benefit of sin, to do sin, really for the benefit of sin. So a date of advantage, in this case, advantage towards sin, which is not an advantage to us. So sin personified. So that's a date of advantage, I would believe. I think I take that as a date of advantage. So what's happening here is that you have two direct objects. You got your members, your melee, and you have them becoming opla. This is like a weapon or instrument. This can be used, a term used for like implements of warfare. And so here it's modified by adikias, a genitive form. So you have this genitive modification. What's happening is you have a double accusative construction. So you can present something, first accusative, as something, second accusative. And when you have a double accusative construction, it really just depends on the verb, which verbs can take two objects. And that's just a matter of their meaning and sense. One of those objects is going to start outside the action of the verb, and then through the action of the verb become the second object. And that second object is called the internal object. It's internal through the action of the internal mechanisms of the verb. The first one of them is going to be the external object. It's going to start outside and then go through the action of the verb and then come out as the internal object. And so you got members, which are starting outside. So don't present your members. So before you're doing any presenting, you have your members, you have your body parts. And then you go through this presentation process, and through that presentation, you make them into instruments of unrighteousness. That's the internal. So your members start outside, external objects, and then they, through this process of presenting, which Paul says, don't do this, don't be presenting them, they become instruments of unrighteousness. So unrighteous instruments. So instruments of performing unrighteousness, we could understand. Yeah, yeah. So he says, don't be doing that. But, and here we get the correction. So we have a may leading to an Allah construction. So Allah indicates a correction. We often think of it as contrast, but it's a little bit more subtle than that. It's actually correction. But present yourselves for the sake of God to God. And you could really, I mean, we could understand that as an indirect object. I'm kind of torn between, are these just the recipients of that? Present yourselves to God. I think that's maybe more like an indirect object. Present yourselves to God as living from the dead, as living from the dead. Now, this living is a participle from zao, and it's present, active, accusative, masculine, plural. And then you have living, you have from the dead. And the OC is a combination of, I believe it's simply just os, and then with the conditional, living, as if you are living from the dead. Okay, so present yourselves as living from the dead. Now, this is developing the metaphor, right? So in baptism, you died with Christ, and then you also are raised up with him into newness of living. And so he's saying, what Paul's saying is, live, present yourselves now as if you have been raised from the dead. Because the life that we now have in Christ, the continued chance at living in this world is anticipating a future resurrection, a future life. It's really like kind of life on borrowed time, but it's a given time to us. It's a given time to live differently in this world. And he says you present yourselves as living. So the living is the external, no, the internal idea that we present ourselves as to God. Yeah. So this is as if living from the dead. Now, we're not actually raised from the dead yet, but proleptically, anticipatorily, we can start to bank living differently in anticipation of our future restoration. And so, indeed, we ought to live differently in this world. And then he says, and present your members as instruments of righteousness to God. Okay, so what's happening in the second part of this right here with the ke is that this verb is resupplied. And and so there's going to be a resupplying of this verbal idea of presenting. And so you're going to have a double object construction once again. So but present yourselves to God as living from the dead, and implied present your members as instruments of righteousness to God, as the direct, as the recipient, the one in whose advantage and who receives us, receives what we're doing. Yeah, so there's a parallelism here, right? You can see the parallelism with members and instruments. One is instruments of unrighteousness. Here you have instruments of rightly relating, righteousness, justice. All right, so Paul's working this out logically, and he has a gar clause. Gar. Gar indicates substantiation. Amartia gar umon u kurievsi. Kurievsi. For sin will not rule you. Now that's kind of tricky because the you is actually the direct object of this verb kurievo. Kurievo, verbs of ruling, dominating, they tend to take genitive direct objects. For sin does not rule you, or will not rule you. So what's the time frame? It's future here. Will not rule you. Is this the is Paul saying this in terms of, like, in the far future, sin's going to be done away with, so it's not ruling you? So it will not be ruling you in the future, and this then is a basis for why now we present our bodily members as instruments of righteousness, because in the future sin's not going to rule us. Or is the future uh, is the future tense here with kuri fc, is this future as like slightly with a imperative kind of sense, like For sin shall not rule you. For you are not under law, but under grace. Yeah, so what's the time frame? Is this a imperatival future that's, like applicable now? It shall not rule you now? Or is it future? In the future, it will not be ruling you. Therefore, you start now to live into that reality. Or maybe it's a little bit of both. Sin will not rule you. And maybe Paul is speaking um, optimistically, like in the present. Maybe this is his experience that even though we struggle with sin, it doesn't get the upper hand with us. And people right now would be going, well, yeah, but what about Romans 7, right? Romans 7 talks about someone who knows the good they ought to do and cannot do it. And we'll have a chance to look at that. And I'm glad I hadn't done that like 3 years ago. If you look at my videos, and I think it's listed, I think I picked up at the end of chapter 7. So indeed, we're going to look at chapter 7, and I think I can show you, I'm pretty sure I can show you, whether you'll be convinced or not, that Romans 7 is a description of someone living under the law without the spirit and without the grace of God and the spirit of Christ. Someone trying their best and they can't do it. And I can show you that because of, if you want to get it, if you're real curious about this, look at 7, 5, and 6. This provides an outline for the next two movements. This is walking in the oldness of the law. This is walking in newness of the spirit. So we'll see that in probably 2 weeks. We won't get to it next week, but the week after. Yeah. So hang on. We're going to get there. Okay. So you are not under law, but under grace. Now, this raises a very interesting potential problem because some people might say that the law is grace and that the law is what helps you not to sin. The law was given as a grace to help us fight sin. So how can you say that we're no longer under law but under grace, and this is supporting that sin is not going to rule us? You see, because you got a couple gar statements which are piling up to keep supporting, and it seems like Paul has is saying something that it's doesn't make sense because the law was given to combat sin. But we have to remember that Paul has argued that actually law makes us aware of sin. And we didn't know that we sinned, but the law told us so. And then we died. But people died before the law was given, before the Mosaic covenant. And here by law, I'm talking about the Mosaic covenant of sacrificial system and God trying to direct his people to live in certain ways. It's a covenant form. But now Paul is saying we're not under that law. And the reason being is because there's been a new standard of rightly relating with God that is attested by the law and the prophets, but came independently of the law and the prophets. And this, you'd have to go back to Romans 3:21. Now, without the law, the righteousness of God has been manifested, being testified by the law and the prophets. Well, what is this righteous relating? What is this rightly relating? Well, it's a righteousness of God that comes through the faithfulness of Jesus Christ to all who believe. Okay? There's no distinction. There's no distinction, he says. There's no distinction between groups, for all have sinned and are falling short of the glory of God. Okay? So this issue of law in relation to the gospel is really important for Paul, and he's going to stop here. There's going to be a pushback. What then? What then is the question. What then? What then does this mean? So if we're no longer under law, but under grace, what does this imply or what does this mean therefore? Ti un, what does this mean therefore? And then he asks a question. And this is a deliberative question. Should we be sinning since or because we are not under law, but under grace? Shouldn't we be sinning or should we be sinning because we're not under law, but under grace? And Paul says, no way. May it not be. May it not be. No, no. This is a deliberative question that starts to extrapolate in a certain direction. Well, if we're not under law, that must mean we can go on sinning or we can sin. And Paul says, nope, that's not true. That's not right. And he's gonna provide explanation for this. Now, verse 16 shows a syndeton. So a syndeton means there's no connector. We've been seeing a pretty good string of connectors here. We've seen several gars lined up. We've seen an un, but there's no connector here. Now, when you have no connector, it raises questions as to what is the relationship of the one next following sentence with the previous one. And Levinson, whose work I summarize in my Koine Greek grammar, he says it's probably because there's some relationship that's not signifiable by a connector. It might be a move from general to specific, or vice versa. It could be a move to an evaluative statement. It could be a question answer, which maybe that's involved here, like he's filling out the response to it. And it's basically a pretty forceful question. So what's happening is that we're getting a Q, an A, that's supposed to be a Q moving to an A, followed by another question. And so we're in a question answer scenario, which is related to the style of argumentation that Paul's in. It's called a diatribe. And so that may account for why there's no connector here, is because it's kind of dealing with short little questions and quick answers. And so, verse 16, do you not know that? So the ook here is working with the question. And when you have an ook with a question, you got to remember the rule of MNOP. So may expects a negative answer. Oo or ookie or ook expects a positive answer. And that's what we have here, the rule of MNOP from the alphabet. Oo is expecting a positive response here. Don't you know that? Well, you should know that. Don't you know that? So here's the content of the knowing. And whenever Paul says, don't you know that, it's a pretty forceful way of saying it. Now, with the Corinthians, he uses this a lot, and he is censoring them and chastising them. So, don't you know that to whom, that's a relative pronoun dative, to whom you are presenting yourselves as servants. So, here's that double accusative again. Here's the external accusative, yourselves, goes through the presenting process. It becomes a servant for obedience. So don't you know that to whom you present yourselves as servants to obedience, that relative pronoun clause ends right there. You are servants to whom you are obeying. Okay, so this is matter of fact. Don't you know that? So here's another uh, relative pronoun clause, that you're basically servants to obey as servants to whomever you obey. So it seems a little tautological, but he's basically just saying definitionally, if you present yourselves as servants to obey, you are indeed servants to whom you obey. All right. So that's what he's saying. You're servants to whom you obey. So look at what you're obeying. Look at whom you're obeying, and you're a servant to that person. And then we have whether it be servants of sin to death or servants of obedience. So the servants here is being understood. This word servant is being re-understood here. And so these genitives are relating and modifying the servants. And he's basically he's with this A to, and with A, he's presenting two alternatives. So the connector A is presenting an alternative, whether this option or whether this other option. Okay. So whether it be a servants of sin, this is a genitive form leading to death, or servants of obedience leading to righteousness, to right living and righteous living. Yeah, so he's laying out these two options here. And this is an add-on, an implied construction. I'm putting it in brackets because it's hanging off of the main clause and resupplying, there's a resupplying of the subject and maybe the verb, whether that be. Whether you are servants of sin to death or servants of obedience to righteousness. Now, the two here, the two is rather interesting. I had to look at this, and I finally found in our lexicon, BDAG, it says, well, technically, this is what's called, and it's a dative form of su, but it's an enclitic particle, a marker of emphasis on the reliability of a statement. So I found that pretty interesting. So it's adding a sense of like certainly, certainly. You could also look this up in LSJ, and it says to look at A. And here's was what I found. So in classical Greek, the alternative introduced by A2 is emphasized, but later no distinction is implied. As an example, Romans 6:16. So what they're saying, according to this lexicon, the Liddell Scott Jones lexicon, they're saying that even though historically in classical Greek, the A2 was once emphasized, that this no longer seems to be the case since we have Romans 6:16, where in their judgment, that's not being stressed. But let's work with the older understanding. I mean, is it possible that Paul is stressing, trying to stress that if indeed you present yourselves as servants of sin, that this leads to death? I mean, might he be stressing that to say, look, if you do it, if this is the alternative that you're going for, it leads to death. I think so. I think it's possible that he is saying, in fact, it works both ways. To death, sin leading to death, or obedience leading to righteousness. So I found that interesting. Now, verse 17 might seem to add some credence to this, that Paul does want to focus that at one time you were servants of sin. Because that's what he says in verse 17. But thanks be to God. Thanks be to God. Now, the be is understood. Let there be thanks, or, the verb to be is understood. There is thanks to God because or that you were servants of sin. But in distinction for that in distinctive development, you obeyed. So these are all past tense forms here. So thanks be to God that you were once, that you were servants of sin, but in this context, there's a contrast implied. New development, it's a contrast because sin is contrasted with not sinning. You obeyed. You obeyed from the heart into which type of teaching was transmitted to you. Now, this is kind of a gnarly construction. It's an incorporated relative pronoun clause in which the object or the referent to the relative pronoun is included in the clause, into which type of teaching. So I'm putting this tupon in parentheses because it really goes with the prepositional phrase, into which type of teaching you were entrusted. And this verb paradidomi, so this is a me verb. There's no iota. The iota, the did has dropped off. I also recognize the theta, eta. So I do, in fact, recognize this as an aorist, passive, indicative, second plural. You were entrusted. This verb is a verb of handing over. This is Judas did this kind of handing over in terms of betrayal. It can mean hand over and betray, but it can also mean to hand over tradition in a good sense. So this verb can be used in its cognates can be used in positive or negative ways. In this passive sense here, it's referring to a reception of tradition and a type of teaching that they received. They were the recipients of, and they obeyed from the heart into this form of teaching. So this ease is interesting because it indicates destination. So you were obedient from the heart into into. So there's stress on that destination into that type of teaching you received. Moreover, da here indicating additional development. We have a prenuclear circumstantial participle clause. Having been set free from sin, you were enslaved to righteousness. So, what a sudden change of events here that Paul starts dropping these past tense, these indicative mood verb forms. And this is even past tense as well. So, these are aorists, and then this is an imperfect. So, you were at one point servants of sin, but things changed. You obeyed what was passed on to you from the heart. You obeyed from the heart. Having been set free from sin, you were enslaved to righteousness. Yeah, you were enslaved to righteousness. So this is a prenuclear participle, elevtherothentes, probably functioning as a as a framework for the you were enslaved. So having been set free from sin, you were enslaved to righteousness. What's being explained here, you kind of have to understand just a little bit. I don't think it's too complicated that slavery was a matter of ownership and that you could transfer owners and that Paul is likening the Christian life to being like under slavery of sorts or servanthood of sorts, which is kind of I think it's meant to be dignifying and equalizing of everybody, right? So this is one of the things that in the early Christian community, you had social stratification, and those on the lowest social ladder are giving a lot of honor because Paul and others are co-identifying with them. And Philippians is a real clear example of this. Paul calls himself a doulos, a servant of Jesus Christ. And then also he describes Jesus as not only becoming a person, an anthropos, but taking on the form of a servant, that Christ himself identifies with a servant role and then is uh, even crucified. The worst form of death non-Romans received was crucifixion. So by using this metaphor, Paul is able to dignify all believers and also say, look, we all have a slave problem, a servanthood and slavery problem to sin, and that we have a history now in the gospel once we've obeyed and take on our new master. That means that we're set free from our previous master and are now enslaved to a different way of living in the world, to righteousness, to the righteousness that God reveals in Jesus, which condemns sin and provides a way out of sinning. And we're going to get to that, providing a way out of sinning. The way out of sinning is setting your mind on the things of the Spirit. Paul's going to talk about that in chapter 8. And already he's kind of setting this up because by identifying with Christ's baptism, we're identifying with his death and his resurrection. And that resurrection life begins to impact us now. The Spirit is a down deposit, and we're walking in newness of life now. So the key for living differently in this world is indeed the Spirit of God and having that Spirit reside inside of us. And now he's working out these dynamics using this metaphor of obedience, of servanthood, whether it's to serve servanthood to sin or servanthood to obedience, whether and the one leads to death, the other leads to life. Yeah, leads to life, leads to righteousness. Okay, I feel like we're covering a lot of ground here. We're not going to finish chapter six. There's too much. I didn't think we'd get this far, but we do have maybe about 10 minutes here. We might be able to do another verse or just call it for today because there's a lot of content here. I think we can do this next week. Do you have any questions? Let me just pause here. My throat is kind of bad, so maybe it's a good time to pause for today. Any questions with the text ideas here? The grammar? These members, I think, probably could refer to your sexual organs, but also just to your hands, right? And to, your whole body parts. So yeah, he is envisioning the whole body and its individual parts. And so all that needs to be handed over. I mean, I suppose our ears or eyes, even, what are we listening to? What are we looking at? These are parts of members of our bodies that we need to recommit to God. Yeah.
Would you please explain a bit more about megenoito? Its grammatical explanation, megenoito.
Yeah, it's a firm denial. It's a firm no. Now, as I've thought about me Ganito, what what I think I'm leaning to is that it's using the optative mood, which is a pretty rare mood. It's dying
Yes.
out, being replaced
Yeah.
by the subjunctive. I think that in my understanding of the moods and prominence, relative prominence, that the optative is the least vivid. It's the least
Mm.
vivid of the moods. The indicative mood is very vivid. The imperative is very pressing. So you maybe have imperative like this must be done. It's like boom in your face. The indicative are statements of fact typically. Then you have subjunctive, and then you have the optative. And I think optative is used for distance, epistemic distancing. And in this kind of me genita is serving to reduce this as a possibility. It's a way of saying no way. This is a remote
No way.
possibility. No way. Yeah, so I think that's
Okay.
how I would explain it. It's a
Okay.
strong denial by way of putting it in the optative.
Okay.
Let
Okay.
let this not be. I mean, it's literally let it not be.
Let it not be.
Let it
So
not be. Yeah.
in modern English sense, we can say by no means. Its meaning, kind of.
That's how it's translated by no means.
Yeah.
Uh,
But
but we
it
maybe
may
need
not be. It may not be. Yeah.
let it not be.
Let
May
it
it
not
not
be.
be. It's almost like a wish. May it
Yeah.
not be.
May
Yeah,
not
may
be.
it not be.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining, and look forward to having you watch and listen next time. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Long.
Yeah, take care.
Thank you, sir.
See ya.